On July 18, Black Rose, Rosa Negra Anarchist Federation's Bay Area local, and AK Press hosted historian Troy Araiza Kokinis to discuss his new book, Anarchist Popular Power, Dissident Labor and Armed Struggle in Uruguay, 1956 to 76. Anarchist Popular Power is the first ever English-language history of the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay. As Araiza Kokinis explains, the FAO organized students and workers to directly confront international and domestic capitalists, far-right violence, and state repression amidst rising IMF-mandated austerity and declining living standards during the 1960s and 1970s. Pushed underground and into exile by governmental ban and a decade of U.S.-backed military dictatorship, the organization has spread its model for revolutionary change around the world since it resurfaced in the mid-1980s. The FAO's innovative engagement with, disciplined commitment to, and steadfast confidence in everyday people's capacities to control their shop floors, classrooms, neighborhoods, and lives offers important lessons for revolutionaries today. If you are inspired to adapt these and other lessons for the so-called United States, reach out to Black Rose, Rosa Negra at blackrosefed.org. Due to some technical issues during the event, the following combines portions of live audio with recreations of the author's talk. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Give it up for yourselves for being out here on a Tuesday night. Thank you all so much for being here. So before we begin, I just want to remind everyone, as you may have seen on signs, we're recording tonight's event. It will be later broadcasted. Thank you all so much for coming today. My name is Juan, and I'm a member of Black Rose, Rosa Negra Anarchist Federation. One of tonight's themes will be celebrating the different elements that make up our movement. So before we begin, I'd like to first thank Tamarack for hosting tonight's conversation. Give it up for Tamarack. I'm sure many of you know Tamarack has been an important social center for the last several years in the Bay Area. And so to keep it here more, please be sure to grab a drink or bite downstairs. A big thank you to Satal for cooking tonight's pop-up menu. Give it up for Satal. Thank you, Satal. I'd also like to thank AK Press for co-sponsoring this event with Black Rose. Radical publishers like them can sometimes be overlooked movement partners. And I thank them for all they've done to share knowledge about lesser-known struggles and compañeras, including the subject of tonight's talk, the Federación Anarquista Uruguaya, or the FAO for short. Over the last several years, editors at AK Press have worked with UC San Diego and Santa Barbara faculty and service worker Troy Andres Araiza Kokinis to transform his doctoral dissertation into Anarchist Popular Power, Dissident Labor and Armed Struggle in Uruguay, 1956 to 76. Troy will soon share, give it up for Troy, published a book. Troy will soon share how he weaved together unique archival research and conversations with FAO militants across multiple countries into the book before you today, the first ever English language history of that anarchist cadre. Numbering no more than a few hundred militantes at its peak, the FAO charted its own anarchist path through trial and error. Its strategy of especificismo argues that anarchists must simultaneously develop a shared politico-ideological vision and goals while advocating for their principles, strategies, and tactics within larger social movement. As part of the dual organizationalist tradition, therefore, they insist anarchists maintain specific anarchist organizations to effectively help mass organizations build the popular power needed to revolutionize society. Earlier European revolutionaries like Mikhail Bakunin and Enrico Malatesta had similarly argued for this strategy against a purely factory floor organization of syndicalists. Anarchists across the world adopted similar strategies and structures, often smuggled to them by exiled émigrés. Despite some familiarity with these debates, the Uruguayan cadre maintains, and history attests, they organically sprouted especificismo from their unique landscape. In this vein, Troy will share harrowing stories of how these comrades participated in and helped initiate massive strike waves and student resistance. He'll explore how, unlike their armed struggle-focused Focoist contemporaries, the Tupamaros, they later linked these widespread campaigns to revolutionary expropriations and factory owner kidnappings to simultaneously win union disputes and prepare for insurrection. And he'll ultimately detail how a military coup backed by the government's executive branch all but smashed revolutionary prospects in one of Latin America's most industrialized countries by restoring law and order through a set of repressive measures that saw dozens of foul militants imprisoned, tortured, and assassinated. But before Troy does that, I'll endeavor to briefly answer two questions. Why, and if at all how, does this history of this small, faraway country matter to us?
Historically, reigning approaches to politics, especially of the reformist and reactionary variety, have unsurprisingly emanated from the north down and from west to east. Europe's imperial and colonial projects throughout much of the last several hundred years enabled its state agents and capital investors to, quote, make that history and access networks, resources, and lackeys to spread their visions, structures, and narratives. Perhaps the most consequential contemporary example of this is the entrenchment of bourgeois democracy throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, all but, quote, ending history as they consumed the former Soviet bloc. Revolutionary socialist politics that aim to transform how we relate to one another and the world around us have often bucked this trend, but primarily latitudinally. Specifically in the 20th century, the leading model for overthrowing capitalism, vanguard Communist Party seizing state power, traveled from east to west. Similarly, Mao Zedong's protracted People's War against Imperial Japan and China's ascendant bourgeoisie put armed guerrilla struggle into revolutionaries' tactical and strategic toolkits. Again, though, the Southern Hemisphere was largely left out of the political equation. One of the few instances of a political strategy traveling from south to north comes by way of especificismo. In the years since the FAO re-emerged after the Uruguayan dictatorship's fall in the 1980s, anarchists near and far have adhered themselves to this approach. Contact with FAO militants inspired Brazilian camaradas to form groups like the FARJ, the Zabalaza Anarchist Communist Federation in South Africa, the French Union Communiste Libertaire, and Germany's Die Plattform have all woven especifista tenets into their activity. Throughout Oceania, growing groups of revolutionaries share lessons about their experiments with the specificismo via the Red and Black Notes blog, and in the United States, Black Rose Rosa Negra adapts the FAO's contributions to practically orient our social insertion in mass movements. Troy will shed more light on what the strategy entails, drawing from the FAO's original text. This wider turn towards the specificismo comes decades after anarchists in the global north, and especially in the United States, consciously abandoned mass politics. As historian Andrew Cornell and sociologist Yuri Gordon explain, decades of concerted state repression and ethnic marginalization largely uprooted anarchism from its immigrant working class base, before upwardly mobile college students reclaimed personally prefigurative variants of it during the 1960s. Even when anarchists publicly returned to the political stage during the late 1990s alter anti-globalization movement, they largely participated individually or in small voluntarist blocks by hopping from summit to summit across the globe. Don't get me wrong. Informal networks and subcultural projects like info shops and zines helped connect generations of militants to each other and positively shaped many aspects of activism in the U.S. during this period. Still, though, anarchists sporadically influenced mass social movements before they ironically helped launch one of the largest in the country's history, 2010's Occupy. As Black Rose argues in our program Turning the Tide, capitalism and the nation-state offer no solutions to the compounding crisis that underlaid Occupy Wall Street's explosion. Those crises have since forcefully erupted in similar forms. Mass mobilizations to secure black lives against all instantiations of white supremacy, airport shutdowns to oppose xenophobic anti-Muslim policies, direct confrontations with anti-LGBTQ fascist foot soldiers, and more. But short-term victories have often been temporary reprieves against these systems' worst excesses, and once the heat in the street simmers, business as usual typically returns. The struggle for sustained wins have pushed veteran and newcomer militants alike to reassess our strategies and commit to long-term organizing projects. Hundreds of thousands have started and joined labor unions over the last several years, and the number of strikes grew over 50% since the pandemic began. Tenant unions of, by, and for ourselves have coalesced into a multinational network, coordinating cross-regional campaigns to support shared struggles. Despite these important inroads we have made toward rebuilding popular power, our movements have still struggled to wrest major concessions. Some have even concluded revolution is impossible, that oppressive ways of structuring social life and their tendencies to crisis are here to stay. I and many others disagree. So how might we maximize the momentum of organizing our co-workers, neighbors, and communities towards a world without capital accumulation, state violence, and hierarchical coercion? How might we replace the everyday drudgery of domination with lives worth collectively living? Troy's investigation of the FAO offers some glimpses into how that might look. Join me by welcoming him to share those sneak peeks.
All right, so before starting to discuss the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation, I'd first like to start off by talking a bit about Cold War era Uruguay. The Cold War Uruguay is a country marked by crisis. This primarily due to a decline in the country's grazing economy. So particularly the commodities such as meat, wool, and hides. The export market around these commodities came to a halt after the international demand plummeted by the end of the Korean War. If you look at the development of Uruguay's economy historically, it was primarily organized around agro-export from its interior. And it was through the growth of this agro-industry that a industrial sector or manufacturing sector was then parlayed and grown by the early 20th century. And so by the time of the Cold War era, with the agro-export industry in crisis, we see a crisis then roll over into the industrial sector. So giving you an example of what that crisis looked like, rural production, which remained steady at about 90% of total exports throughout the post-war era, yet the total proportion of primary production for export fell from 49% to 26% from 1941 to 1961. Okay, so here you still see the economy is driven by rural production, yet the proportion of its exports is basically cut in half by the early 1960s. And so the early 20th century demand for Uruguayan agro-export really comes from a demand in the North American and European wartime economies. So one of the best examples of this would be the canned corned beef called fribentos. There's a whole sort of mythology around fribentos in England, for example. Fribentos is still a town on the banks of the Rio Uruguay, just on the other side of the border from Argentina. It is host to the first modern refrigeration factory, which grew and developed there by the end of the 19th century. It at one time employed upwards of 12 to 14,000 workers from upwards of 24 different countries were represented there in its workforce. It hosted what was considered the first modern refrigeration system for a meat packing plant. And so from here developed the corned beef label fribentos that was one of the main staples of the British Army's wartime diet. There's mythologies around these cans of corned beef as having stopped bullets from hitting British soldiers in the back because instead they had this canned beef located in their backpack and it had stopped the bullet. By the 1960s, demand for products such as fribentos corned beef in Europe or North America had been cut into half. In this decline in exports brought a crisis to the national economy. More than half of Uruguayans by the mid-20th century were employed by the state. So the decline in exports brings a crisis in the ability to maintain state-based administrative jobs that were primarily funded through taxation. Brings a crisis to the Uruguayan welfare state. Uruguay, beginning in the early 20th century, had gained the reputation of being Latin America's Switzerland for having developed such a well-functioning sort of welfare state model. as well as this brings a crisis in import substitution industrial production. Okay, so the ability for a sort of state-driven manufacturing sector to be able to reproduce itself, primarily through the revenue generated in the agro industry, which was then turned over and used to subsidize lucrative national industries. So all of that is thrust into crisis when demand for Uruguayan export products is cut into half. Foreign markets by this time, by the mid-20th century, begin reorienting towards places like Australia and New Zealand. Uruguayan landowners refuse to invest in new technologies and agricultural stock, which further accelerate the decline. Moreover, this rural crisis reverberated in the industrial sector. You begin to see significant capital flight that's due to an unpredictable economy and a shortage of money. You begin seeing inflation rates as high as 136% per year. Okay, this beginning by the early 1960s. A statistic here from 1956 to 1972, gross national product fell 12%. Per capita gross national product stagnated at about $500 for this duration as well. While Uruguayans had enjoyed the highest per capita income any Latin American country in 1956, real salaries dropped to nearly 24% over the next decade. It is under these conditions in which the FAO, the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation, originates. The FAO was birthed in 1956 in Montevideo's working-class neighborhood El Cerro, which was once home to nearly half a dozen meat packing plants, including the Frigorífico Nacional, the national packing house, one of the primary sources of employment or fountains for employment in the area, all of which by 1969 have shut down and are liquidated. It's from this neighborhood that the FAO is born, primarily as a project between some Spanish anarchist migrants who had arrived to Uruguay by the 1930s, but mostly by native-born Uruguayans, most of whom are employed in the refrigeration plant sector, who also belong to the Graphic Artists Union, which was a long-standing anarchist stronghold, the Bakers Union as well, another long-standing anarchist stronghold. And they set out to develop a sort of strand of anarchism that builds off of the influence of anarchist syndicalism, but develops nuances that would be fitting for the Uruguayan context. And this is how they develop this idea of especifismo. It's a form of anarchist or platform anarchism that the FAO really pioneers as a project in an era during which the sort of heyday of anarcho-syndicalism is long gone. Anarchists who are still interested in a class-based anarchism and a form of organized anarchism coalesce around this project of the specific anarchist organization. So one in which anarchist groups would be federated into an anarchist organization, that being the Uruguayan Anarchist Federation. Members of this federation would have the obligation of inserting themselves into mass organizations, particularly labor unions, and agitating within those spaces to make anarchist ideals and practices hegemonic. The FAO would also be influenced by the Cuban Revolution by 1959. This would eventually cause a rift in the group by the year 1962. The FAO took on the position as offering critical support for Cuba. This long after word had gotten out of Cuba of Castro's persecution of anarchist militants within that country. The FAO, regardless, saw Cuba as a sort of representation of a Latin American path towards revolution. And I will get into that in a little bit. The group would never grow to be more than 200 militants. It's most likely to have really been roughly around 80 firmly active militants. You can add around another 100 there of folks that were sort of loosely affiliated with the organization in some sort of way. By 1967, the group would begin operating clandestinely after being banned by the government of Jorge Pacheco Areco. This being after a news organ called Época in which the FAO published alongside 5 other New Left organizations, including the Tupamaros, would be banned. So all of those, the news organ itself, as well as the organizations participating in it, would be banned as part of Pacheco Areco's first decree upon taking office in 1967. That news organ, Época, was famously edited by Eduardo Galeano. Uruguay would be under martial law for all but 2 months between December 1967 and June 1973, when it would eventually see a proper civic military coup. Okay, so these are the conditions under which the FAO is operating. Regarding the shift towards Cuba as a key inspiration for the FAO's form of Latin American anarchism, I make the following claim in my book. Inspired by the Cuban Revolution, FAO's Latin Americanist anarchism marked a break from the historical European migrant torchbearers of the movement in the region. At the turn of the century, Southern and Eastern European anarchist migrants brought with them a global perspective rooted in their international travels. Such movement, often forced due to exile or political persecution, laid the foundation for a global anarchist movement of the time. These workers who moved across borders found themselves in similar exploitative conditions no matter the country of their workplace. However, mid-century working-class Uruguayans were autochthonous. Many were born in Montevideo's western neighborhoods of El Cerro and La Teja, or internal migrants from racialized regions in the northwest of the country. The, quote, new working class came into contact with a previous generation of mostly non-active anarchist militants from Eastern and Southern Europe, and although they borrowed from the analyses of their immigrant elders, their life experiences were situated more strictly within the realities of mid-century Latin America and Uruguay, and they knew little beyond their local realities aside from some media representations, which included the excitement of poor peoples globally around the success of the Cuban Revolution. FAO could not ignore that reality and thus grounded its Pan-American and anti-imperialist position firmly in the fervor surrounding Third World liberation struggles, particular to this historical moment. The FAO expressed critical support for the Cuban Revolution and situated itself among the growing Latin American New Left. While FAO argued that the Cuban FOCO guerrilla strategy was neither effective nor generalizable throughout the continent, the organization warmly received the Cuban Revolution as an example of popular upheaval outside of the hegemony of a Moscow-influenced Communist Party. In spite of FAO's opposition to FOCO, the group strongly advocated for the use of armed struggle alongside a mass political strategy, primarily rooted in the labor movement. The organization's position proved unique among anarchist organizations globally, and eventually brought them into tension with more traditional currents of anarchism within Uruguay. Yet their nuanced interpretation of armed struggle also positioned them in competition with Uruguay's hegemonic armed New Left organization, the National Liberation Movement Tupamaros. Thus, FAO's support for the Cuban Revolution, yet opposition to FOCO, challenged dominant ideals and strategies associated with both anarchism and Third World liberation. Yet their policies are best described as a syncretism of both, an anarchism for the South. So in some ways, this might be the thesis of the book. The FAO is most well-known regionally for its synthesis of Third World Marxism and traditional anarchism, particularly anarcho-syndicalism, in a type of project that its militants really believed to have made sense in the mid-century Uruguayan context. The FAO viewed Cuba as a conceptual vanguard. Below, I offer a quote from a 1968 pamphlet of the FAO's called Rojo y Negro, or Red and Black, where they claim the old red and black flag of the anarchists, its vital attitude, its libertarian communism. That is its vital message. But along the way, anarchism has taken up a negative meaning, one that is not valid. Individualism, spontaneity, anti-organization, a sectarian ideology, an unliberating sclerosis. The old anarchist flag has been planted by new hands. It is the flag of the Latin American Revolution, the red and black of Fidel, of Camilo, and of Che, that of July 26th and the assault on Moncada, of the guerrilla in our continent. It is that of the old and new causes for socialism and freedom, for anti-imperialism and for anti-capitalism, that of forging a new man and a new society. In this way, we are setting out to be one more of the little motors behind the broader popular movement that will march towards revolution in our country, Uruguay. So perspectives such as the one just read are vast. And it's not to say that the FAO understood the Cuban revolutionaries to be anarchists. certainly did not see Castro as being an anarchist. But they saw symbolic value in Cuba's sort of unique path towards revolution in an era in which revolutionary strategy was being guided globally by the hegemony of the Soviet Union. But the Cubans, guided by particularly Che Guevara's Marxist humanism, offer what was a intervention in Marxist theory. So particularly an intervention in the Marxist idea of historical materialism, or that historical change, social transformation comes in stages, and that this is somewhat of an objective fact, and it's rooted to structural contradictions within the economy, and that it just occurs. This is called the Marxist dialectic in a crude sense. Okay, for the Cubans, they argue no, that revolution is a subjective question, and that revolutionary transformation is a product of mass subjective transformation. Che particularly comes up with this concept of the new man. Okay, the new man is a revolutionary, is committed to revolutionary goals and objectives, is committed to an obliteration of one's own ego, a commitment to the sort of collective and the community around them. And for Cubans, this mass subject transformation or subjective transformation is what causes revolutionary transformation at a structural scale. And so it's an intervention into this idea that the working class is waiting for the right objective conditions for revolution. The Cubans said no. Revolutionary transformation is a subjective question, and everyday people can make it happen. And the FAO is very much sort of cut from the same orange, if I want to directly translate from Spanish. So the FAO sees revolutionary potential in organized labor, but they do not see this potential as existing objectively in the Marxist sense, right? This idea that the proletariat is some revolutionary class objectively. Instead, the FAO argued that labor had to come into being as a revolutionary force. The power had to be built, not taken, and that this was a question of accumulating experiences confronting one's own conditions. And that coming into being as a revolutionary force is what the FAO calls popular power. And it is in that they're in dialogue with Cuba and seeing that everyday people are indeed revolutionary protagonists and subjectively play a role in revolutionary transformation. For the FAO, the question was how to build this revolutionary subjectivity in an Uruguayan context. And there was a place for everyone.
Hay una juventud que es la que impulsa, hay una juventud que es la que avanza, hay una juventud que evoluciona y hay otra juventud que retrograda. Hay una juventud embestecida, bordeando los abismos de la infamia, con 20 años en el cuerpo joven y más de un siglo que le encorva el alma. La juventud antípoda del hombre es esa juventud esclavizada, tránfuga del deber en la gran hora que América irredenta la reclama. La juventud que está no se arrodilla, la juventud no sabe estar postrada, que no hay fuerza más fuerte que la suya, que es tanto el ideal de una gran causa. La juventud es vida y es belleza, es espíritu, luz, sangre, esperanza, que arroja los fetiches milenarios junto a los mitos de la creencia arcaica. Jóvenes son aquellos los que llevan como un arco de triunfo en la mirada todo el espacio azul, mil horizontes y un incendio de soles en el alma. No son jóvenes, no, los que claudican, no son jóvenes, no, los que se arrastrarán, juventud rebelarse contra todo lo que limita la grandeza humana. Dejemos los eunucos, los cobardes, lo mismo que una barca abandonada, aguarda.
Uruguay had, arguably, outside of Greece and Italy, the largest presence of the Communist Party anywhere outside of the Eastern Bloc. It was certainly the largest Communist Party presence in Latin America. And the Communist Party in Uruguay, similar to Communist parties throughout the world at this time, was sort of wedded to an electoral strategy. Okay? So during the Cold War, the Communist Party, the capital C Communist Party, the strategy that was the consensus amongst these communist parties comes out of Russia. Okay, to be a communist party and claim to have the capital CP, right, meant that you belonged to the Comintern. There was a consensus in the Comintern around electoralism and organizing a sort of base in the labor movement. Okay, so a base of a sort of electorate within the labor movement. I mean, it's a little bit more complex than that, but at the end of the day, there were a party that was running in elections. It was an electoral strategy is what they were sort of focused on. And that's not to say that they didn't put significant amounts of effort into organizing labor. In the case of Uruguay, they had maintained about 2/3 of the labor movement. Okay, so 2/3 of the labor movement in Uruguay was under Communist Party organization. Okay, the majority of the time. The other 1/3, which is quite unique, was under the influence of a faction within the labor movement, or a tendency that was called the Tendencia Combativa, the combative tendency. This was a coalition of new left organizations that was really spearheaded by the FAO, that had presence in some of Uruguay's most lucrative industry. Okay, so for example, bank tellers were organized in the combative tendency. Okay, you would have strikes of some 12,000 bank tellers across the country that would just cripple the financial industry. And these were like, and I go through them, I have like an entire chapter dedicated to the 1968-1969 bank workers conflicts. They were like blowing up banks themselves. During one of these conflicts, the FAO launches its armed apparatus called the OPR 33, the Revolutionary Popular Organization 33. It was primarily a bunch of bank tellers that storm into the stock exchange after stealing the national flag from the National Library and pour acid all over the circuit board, okay? They were occupying banks. I mean, some of these strikes were lasting 9 months of bank tellers. Another lucrative industry that was primarily in the grasp of the FAO was the only tire factory in Uruguay. Funza. It was a rubber factory. They made like gloves and stuff too, but they were also the only domestic producers of tires. Okay? It was a FAO stronghold. And then a lot of like smaller sort of small size factories of some 200, 300 workers, like shoe factories, etc. Okay? But the point is that this coalition maintained about 1/3 of the labor movement at the time. And this was a type of unionism that we would call sort of a militant trade unionism. They advocated for the use of direct action tactics in the workplace. They were opposed to negotiations with employers. They had this concept of workplace conflicts that were a sort of community responsibility. In other words, reproducing these workplace conflicts was something that was done outside of the workplace too, and that was also a site for the formation of revolutionary subjectivity. And this is important because it's expanding this notion until we get sort of post-1971, when a coalition around the Communist Party loses an election. You start to see unions that are organized by Communist parties do things like factory occupations or prolonged strikes. Prolonged strikes mean 10, 30-day strikes. Some of these strikes would go months. Those types of workplace actions you see primarily coming out of this current, the Tendencia Combativa. Okay? And it's by commitment. It's by a type of politics that saw direct action as having a revolutionary function. Okay, so in order to understand what that means, we kind of have to go into what is a crude Marxist understanding of social change. Okay, Marxism talks about this type of dialectic, that there's these dialectical forces between labor and capital, and it's almost a scientific fact that the contradictions are going to generate a crisis, right? And it's going to generate some sort of transition into a new mode of production. Objective. FAO, with its influence and dialogue with the Cubans, are arguing that no, actually revolution is something that is subjectively generated. Okay, there's a role for a historical protagonism of everyday people in generating the conditions of revolution. Okay, the Cubans made this intervention in Marxist theory in their concept of the folk, that armed struggle was a viable path towards revolution in the global south. Why? Because these dialectical conditions of capitalism, i.e. between labor and capital, didn't really exist in the global south. You didn't have a modern industrial economy in the global south. You had agrarian economies. You had things that looked more like feudalism, slavery, that exist in economies of the global south. You don't have a large industrial proletariat like Marx is talking about from his experiences in analyzing Europe. And so the Cuban question was, well, in the global south, you generate revolution through subjective commitment. You can generate a small sort of foci, a nucleus of committed revolutionaries that can skip this sort of objective dialectical process that Marx calls historical materialism. You generate an armed foco, you build up support for that armed foco amongst peasantry, you advance on the capital, and you overthrow the state, you implement socialism. Well, the FAO isn't drawing directly from this model because they're actually opposed to FOCO theory. But they see the Cuban influence as being very important for the experience in the global south because it argues that you do not have to wait for these objective conditions to implode on themselves. There is a role for everyday people as historical protagonists. And that the role of the revolutionary organization is to essentially fuel that fire and is to support and encourage everyday people to confront sort of the contradictions, systemic contradictions that they're facing on their own collectively. And they talk about something called accumulating experiences. The sort of commitment to direct action that they express is almost like an ethical one because they see these as opportunities, every strike, every occupation, every sort of expression of sabotage. They see these as opportunities to develop a revolutionary counter-subjectivity, to learn how to confront capitalism, to learn what that means at a subjective level, to learn one's own limitations, to develop skills, to respond to capital's response, to develop a sense of courage, right? So as people are doing these things, they're transforming themselves because they're learning, they're accumulating these experiences as being historical protagonists. And they're developing a repertoire of tools, a tool set, that eventually they would argue would come into play in a type of revolutionary situation. So they see the strike, so they talk about sort of a horizon of a revolutionary general strike, the FAO does, in a kind of anarcho-syndicalist tradition. But that's not just something that kind of just comes out of nowhere, right? It needs to be planned for it, and people need to develop the skills for it. How do you sustain this thing? All right, we're going on a prolonged strike. What do you do now? How do you get food to these people? How do we get stuff that we need? How do we sustain this thing? What do we do when employers start making this, that, and this move? What do we do when the police come and intervene? What kind of skills do we have for confronting police and military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? In this way, they recognize this question of revolution as a question around subjectivity. Okay, so generating a revolutionary subject. And when that's massified, then they're talking about popular power. Okay, so their notion of popular power in the book is called Anarchist Popular Power because they talk about this concept of popular power in which this revolutionary subjectivity is something that is collective, is massified, is shared amongst a whole lot of people that have these skills to subjectively transform society. They're interested in building those skills, and they see workplace struggles, neighborhood struggles, student movement struggles as the sort of sites in which those skills can be built. Juan used the word especificismo, and so this goes back into then the question, so what is the role then of this political organization? The political militants, according to FAO, their obligation or their responsibility was to essentially insert themselves into mass struggles. And in many ways, this just happened organically because this stuff was going on everywhere, right? There was conflict, strife going on all throughout the country. So it was organically sort of taking place. The role of the militant was to be there to support these things, give perspective and analysis, develop sort of lists of priorities of sort of what's going on and how to confront these types of things so that there's, insert themselves into conversations and debates that are occurring sort of organically at these times as crisis is further and further entrenching, to build a sort of hegemony around direct action tactics and to build this revolutionary subjectivity. Right? So fanning the flames of direct action so that people are more and more developing this skill set, more and more sort of suspicious of the states and state avenues, more and more delinking their struggles from what was the hegemonic sort of left expression being the Communist Party, and in many ways organically orienting themselves to a type of anarchist politics and practices really without
sort of waving a red and black flag or even using the terms of anarchism at all. Here there's some kind of dialogue with the Trotskyist strategy of entryism, right? But Trotskyists generally enter into sort of mass movements with the purpose of recruiting folks to a party, to support a party and a sort of party's position. Social insertion attempts to just build a counter-hegemony of anarchist praxis organically within a population, so that everyday people are practicing a type of anarchist politics without any type of political dogma or ideology in and of itself. In many ways, that just entailed spending a lot of time inserted into rooms of debate and arguing for certain positions around strategy and tactics and trying to win rank and file or the base support around these types of things. And they called this a political compromise. Every militant that belonged to the FAO was obligated to participate in some sort of popular sector. They were obligated to be a part of a union and really to be an active member in that union. And this wasn't, sort of parachuting into something. This was done essentially at the place where they were located. Okay, so you were obligated to sort of be a militant in the place where you were at. Okay, and advocate these types of positions in them and try to win popular opinion around them. A small group of folks within the FAO would participate in this armed unit that they developed, Revolutionary Popular Organization. And the way they conceived of armed struggle was quite different than the Cuban FOCO model. So the Cuban FOCO model argues that this small group of armed revolutionaries, they can wage guerrilla warfare from the countryside and advance and essentially take on the military and the police in an armed confrontation. The FAO argued that this strategy was suicide. Okay, they said that there is a role for an armed apparatus, but that role is to assist in popular conflict. Okay, what did that look like? Well, maybe there would be a factory that would have been, in a workplace conflict for 14 months, such as the case of the Sorel shoe factory. Okay, this is something that I write about in one of these chapters. In 1972, there's a shoe factory that's under conflict for 14 months. It's got 400 workers in it. And the workers themselves are exhausting all the tactics that they can utilize in the workplace. Okay, they've already been on strike. They're trying other stuff. They're also trying even legal avenues, etc. They're not making any headway. One of the workers there was linked to a member of the FAO and says, hey, I think we're going to need a little extra. And the FAO goes, all right, we got you. All right. Members of the OPR 33, the OPR, were primarily living clandestinely. They were living underground. They would live in safe houses and only really come public when they would carry out some sort of armed activity. So robbing a bank, or in this case, kidnapping the employer's son. Okay, so one of the chapters, chapter 5, looks at a safe house that is organized by two women who were living together, who were both FAO militants who did reconnaissance. So they did reconnaissance for the armed apparatus. One of them would link up, for example, with a male member of the organization, and they would scope out Sergio Molejero, which is the name of the son of the factory boss, his visitation schedule to his girlfriend on the outskirts of the city. And they would sit at a park for hours, twirling each other's hair, tickling each other's sort of cheeks or whatever, giving little kisses, acting as if they were a couple. They were young. They were in their late teens, early 20s at this time. And then document all of the information of what his patterns were. And eventually one day, a group of armed FAO folks went and intercepted his car and held him. They would have, for example, in some of these safe houses, compartments that were constructed by members of the FAO who were construction workers, like underground compartments that they call people's jails. There's a great documentation of something that looks like this in the Uruguayan rival armed organization, the more famous one, the Tupamaros, which is eventually becomes a Marxist-Leninist organization. But you can see what something like this looks like in the film State of Siege by Cosas Gavras. It's a 1973 film documenting the Tupamaros kidnapping of Dan Mitrione, who was a U.S. aid representative who was training the Brazilian and Uruguayan police in tactics of torture. He was eventually kidnapped and killed by the FAO's rival organization, the Tupamaros. It held them in these holding facilities called, the people's prisons, and demand a resolution to the workplace conflict before releasing. And this happened some 7 or 8 times. And so for the FAO, that was the function of an armed apparatus. Okay, it wasn't to confront the police and military head on. It was to intervene in popular struggles that just needed an extra push, as well as to rob banks, to generate financial means of reproducing the political organization, especially at a time in which it was operating clandestinely underground. By the time the Uruguayan military enters into politics by June 1973, the FAO, the coalition around the FAO, really spearheaded by the FAO, the Tendencia Combativa, had organized 1/3 of the labor unions in the country. But while it was a minority within the labor movement, the tendencia. My book actually argues that the types of tactics and strategies that it was advocating for within Uruguayan labor were responsible for spawning the coup. By the time of the June 1973 coup, then President Juan Maria Bordaberry insisted that the military's participation in politics represented a compromise between what he called, quote, chronic anarchy and a, quote, true military takeover. So he called it a civic military coup in which he dissolved parliament and allowed the military to enter into politics, but still sort of maintained a type of shadow function of the executive branch. Now, the justification for this, the civic military government that comes into place prioritizes labor reform immediately upon taking power. The Minister of Defense, Walter Ravena, declared his commitment to, quote, uprooting the Marxist infiltration of Uruguayan society. He recognized the influence of organizations, quote, further to the left than communists, and insisted, quote, there was no turning back possible, there would be no mediation or negotiation. This government, the civic military government, enjoyed strong support from Uruguayan industrialists who shared the opinion that the labor movement, not the Tupamaros, who were, I mentioned earlier, they kind of played this role of a boogeyman in Uruguay at the time, this armed organization, that the labor movement was the largest threat to national security in the country. Over half of the Uruguayan industrialists at the time of the coup declared control of labor unrest as the government's largest accomplishment, not a guerrilla threat. This guerrilla threat that was represented by the Tupamaros, who was, again, the sort of mainstream or the more sort of notable armed left organization at the time. And most of these folks understood the Tupamaros not to be a FOCO-based organization, but to actually be an armed organization that was integrated into the labor movement. In other words, they couldn't distinguish between what the FAO was doing in their armed strategy and what the Tupamaros were doing. They understood armed left activity as being integrated into the labor movement. And the only group that was actually advocating for such a strategy like that was the FAO. Again, this is part of their justification of why the coup or what purpose the coup would serve was to crush labor and crush a sort of guerrilla threat tangentially. And they only recognized the sort of threat of the guerrilla as being sort of noteworthy because they saw it as being integrated into organized labor. So building up to the time of the coup in 1973, the FAO would actually relocate to Buenos Aires in exile. There they would produce literature that they would smuggle across the border clandestinely across the river, still sort of promoting a type of popular resistance to the then dictatorship, but from abroad as a political organization. They had some contacts that remained in Uruguay. But much of the organization relocates to Buenos Aires by 1973. Buenos Aires at this time in 1973 is the only country in the southern cone that is not yet under military dictatorship. So Brazil is under dictatorship in 1964. Uruguay falls June 1973. Chile, September 11th, 1973. Bolivia is in and out of dictatorship essentially for the entirety of the 20th century. Paraguay is under Alfredo Stroessner, a close ally of Adolf Hitler, who sustains a type of caudillo-esque dictatorship for about 40 years in that country. In 1973, Argentina, which had gone through about 19 changes in governments from 1975 to 1973 after the overthrow of Perón, many of those governments being dictatorships, in 1973 happened to not be under dictatorship. It becomes kind of a converging site for the left. So you have leftist exiles who are converging in Buenos Aires from Bolivia, Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay. The FAO joins this group. Most famously, some of the larger groups, including the Tupamaros, link up with the Argentine ERP and Montoneros and the Chilean MIR. They begin clandestinely producing semiotic weapons in their own sort of clandestine factory in Buenos Aires. The FAO did not participate in this coalition that they called the JCR-10, but they were there as part of this sort of left milieu that was exiled in Buenos Aires. There, they maintain roughly 24 clandestine safe houses, as well as they purchase about 12 vehicles. Okay, and they're funding these efforts in which they're sustaining the lives of militants who are there in exile, who are also then transporting material into Uruguay. They're sustaining this effort with ransom money, primarily after the kidnapping of Federico Hart, I want to say still somewhere in the top 5 largest ransoms ever collected. They collect $10 million from him and his family in 1974. This was a Dutch wool exporter that was operating in both Argentina and Uruguay. He was already kind of just generally hated by populations in the region because he was operating contraband. He was smuggling. So they figure, hey, we're going to go get this guy because no one already likes him. And it was actually, the sum was because of a botched translation. They actually asked for 2 millones, and his family understood 10 millones. And so they end up having a whole lot of money. And they're using this money to, again, sustain a sort of resistance to the Uruguayan dictatorship back home from abroad. But this puts them largely into the crosshairs of the Argentine military government, who is aware that they have this type of money. So Argentina falls into dictatorship sort of softly by 1975 and eventually fully by 1976. This is the famous National Plan of Reorganization and the Dirty War, which is where you get the desaparecidos. So by 1976, that's the context in which these anarchist exiles from Uruguay are in Buenos Aires. And essentially they become sitting ducks. They become targeted with what was the first internationally or regionally coordinated plan for repressing leftists within Argentina, famously known as Plan Condor. Okay, so this was a network that was actually developed by 1973. It consisted of shared information infrastructure between the governments of Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia. They would track the movement of leftists across borders. So there was already a sort of infrastructure there for tracking movement. There hadn't yet been a clear sort of operative of state terrorism yet executed. One of the first internationally coordinated operations that comes out of this Plan Condor targets the FAO in Buenos Aires. It begins on the night of June 10th, 1976. Right after Henry Kissinger communicates to the military government of Argentina in a meeting in Chile where he says, right, infamously, if there's something you have to do it quickly. This right after the Argentine military had just taken power in the country. He gives them sort of a green light. The next day, they begin targeting members of FAO as a sort of pilot project for what's later to come in Argentina, which sees the disappearance of upwards of 30,000 people, primarily Argentines. Members of FAO are disappeared out of their homes, brought to a clandestine center known as Automotores Orletti. It was a mechanic shop that the Argentine military was renting from the owner, and they were operating in the back a torture center. There would be sort of folks in the front of the mechanic shop, members of the Argentine military that were collaborating with right-wing paramilitary groups who were mostly sort of plainclothes cops or their relatives, things like this. Disappearing folks, maintaining this facade, dressed in sort of, overalls or jumpsuits, right? Sort of hacking away at the chassis with a wrench, acting like they were working on cars at this mechanic shop. Meanwhile, the back of it was a torture center for leftists. Okay, the FAO being some of the main folks who were detained there from Uruguay. You would see folks disappeared there from Bolivia, Argentina, neighboring Chile, and Brazil, as well as a couple of Cubans as well, who are operating in the region. I go into details around the sort of torture methods and all of these things that are in the book from testimonies that people shared with me. I don't want to sort of share them in the room. You can read about them. They're quite intimate. But a lot of the folks that I spoke with were survivors of this site, Automotores Orletti, who just happened to be survivors because, while the Uruguayan government was trying to mask a continued threat of a guerrilla movement in the country well into the dictatorship, even after the FAO had already exiled and the Tupamaros had agreed to a ceasefire in 1972. So what they did was they flew a couple dozen FAO militants from Buenos Aires back to Montevideo, brought them to what they called Chalet Suzy, which was a fake safe house, and organized a fake military raid on what was a falsely still operating armed left organization within the country. And that's how folks who I spoke to were able to survive. Because those that didn't come over on what they called the first flights of Orletti were murdered in the same way that many leftists in the region were murdered, and that is by being brought into an airplane or a helicopter and thrown out of a vessel into the River Plate with weights tied to their legs. Okay, so that's how much many of their comrades died were in Orletti with them. And so those who survived participate in sharing their oral testimonies with me. So that's kind of a summation of the main sort of historical narrative. One thing I just want to say to conclude is I mentioned before that I was counting workplace actions That was one of the methods that I used for constructing the narrative and making sense of it. There was something that just absolutely stuck to me. It was a comment made by one of the interlocutors, Augusto Chacho Andres. I was finding all of these labor conflicts. I was often going over to his house every Sunday, and we would be talking, and it was very informal, and I was getting a lot of rich sort of narrative, but I wanted to sort of make sense of some of the more quantifiable data. And I asked him, hey, can you go through sort of these workplace struggles that I have mapped out here on this Excel sheet, and can you try to recall whether or not these struggles were won or not, these factory conflicts were won or not? I want to kind of just be able to mark, which one of these factory conflicts were won, which one of them were lost, and he just goes, why do you want to know? You only win when you make the revolution.
Thank you for the fabulous talk. Two technical questions. What was the population of Uruguay at this time? And secondly, did I understand you right when you said that during one of these years there was about 2,000 labor actions per year? Yeah. That's like 6 or 7 per day. Yeah. Unreal. Yeah. So those questions.
Yeah. Population was around 3 million people, of which around 2 live in Montevideo. It's a country in which the majority of the population is centered in Montevideo. The majority of the economic might comes from the countryside. So there's like the number is somewhere around 60 cows to every human being in Uruguay. When I was living in Montevideo, for example, there would be like every Tuesday and Friday or something, you would just get this like whiff of like cow shit. And like, what's going on? Right? And I learned that it was like these like barges that were transporting live cattle out of Uruguay. And it was blowing in from the sea, either to US, Europe, or China was the primary consuming markets. So the economic might is in the countryside, agro-export, because by Uruguayan law, you can't have like factory farming. Well, I guess you would call it, it is agro-industrial economy. They have to be free-range organic cows. So the Uruguayan cattle is it's sought after. But the majority of the population is in Montevideo. The latter question about the conflicts, yes, there was some 2,000. The highest I ever encountered was somewhere around 400. But again, the press is censored, and page 5 of the Communist Party organ is only presenting you with so much. What I had understood from really Mechoso's numbers, and I trust Mechoso, because Mechoso was rigorous in his intellectual work. He had counted upwards of 2,000 at the time. In a baker's strike alone, right? How do you quantify a workplace action, right? You're on strike already. All right, well, now the factory is getting occupied. Now there's bankers up on the rooftop throwing water balloons down at their bosses. Is that 3? That all just happened in one day. Now there's someone who got in a fist fight with their boss and spit in their face. Is that 4? You get what I mean? So, there's micro actions, and then there's the larger ones that are documented. And I only really set out to document things I think I categorize it as workplace actions lasting more than 3 days, more than 10 days, and then occupations. And those are the quantifiable categories that I use. There's other quantifiable categories you can obviously use, and I sprinkle a lot of narrative around these types of things going on. During a strike of appliance workers that were producing laundry machines at the TEM factory, the ROE, in response to a boycott, went to every single shop in Montevideo that sold TEM products, poured citric acid into where you would put detergent, and spray painted the machine saying, "Be careful of TEM appliances, they might blow up on you." Because I guess, I don't know what happens, but apparently if you put citric acid or something into a laundry machine, it starts to shake and do all this stuff and then bubbles over and just crumbles on itself, right? So they did this at all these sites. How many does that count as, right? There was a whole day where they did that. That's a Mechoso number, is 2,000. You know who I'm referring to. But in my counts, I got up to, and I also use a number that was counted by the Uruguayan military one year, and I want to say it was that was a year that was in 700 or something that they counted. So there's just a lot of stuff going on.
You can talk a little bit about that context. I'm interested if you could say a little bit about the legacy of the FAO in Uruguay after 73.
Oh, yeah.
And it basically becomes an organ of electoral politics, People's Victory Party, if I'm not misunderstanding that. And then furthermore, it's sort of what I would see as kind of insidious legacy of platformism and specificismo in our current context and groups like NEFAC, for example, where it seems to me that while the content may be quite different, the same basic formal principle is preserved, that there's a necessity for a mediating organ or body, and specifically a mediating subjectivity that will constitute a molar aggregate and transform what is seen as some sort of implicit revolutionary anarchist sentiment within people. And I think in our current situation, one thing that's really striking is that one of the ways biopower functions is actually by producing subjectivities and actually inculcating and cultivating them in people. The idea now, it seems we're switching to a point where contestation, the unorthodox, base hostility, which used to, maybe in the Cold War and certainly before when the Ukrainians were drafting the platform, these provoked a kind of panic in hegemonic institutions, whereas now they're readily kind of drawn back in for the large part and recuperated. And to me it seems like what is allowable there is the principle of delegation, as opposed to pure self-organization. And to me, the platform implicitly functions on this notion that revolt must be managed, it must be guided, it must be delegated. And I'm not sure how much that actually exists in the original FAO groupings, but it certainly seems to be the legacy that people from outside of that context have sort of embraced from it. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how it's influenced more contemporary struggles.
Cool. The first one, the PUP. Yes, there was a split in exile. Primarily after FAO absorbed a faction of the Tupamaros into its ranks. Much of those folks eventually split alongside who was an OG FAO militant, Hugo Corres, into the PUP. And that's something I really don't spend much time on because I don't find it to be very relevant. Neither of them, neither the FAO nor the PUP, since that era, since the split, have really had much of an impact. Nothing like before. So that's why I ended in 1976, is because the split actually occurs in 1975. By 1976, you have the Orletti incident, the Chalet Suzy, where they bring him back to Uruguay. I intentionally don't get into these sort of differences that sort of go beyond that. Someone else can write that. I'm not particularly interested in left-sectarianism as much. Just as a personal intellectual endeavor. That said, in a meeting I will debate. If we're trying to debate around strategy, right? I don't want to write about it. I don't want to be a guy who writes about it. The PUP is a small faction within the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, who had won political executive power and parliamentary power since the early 2000s up into the last election in Uruguay. Most famously represented by the presidency of Pepe Mujica, who we might be aware of. So the People's Victory Party, which was a split from the FAO, belongs to the coalition that made up the Broad Front. The FAO still exists as the FAO. So there were members that wanted to maintain the anarchist tradition who didn't sort of go into the electoral. And that the PUP split was much more sort of a project of Hugo Corres. He was the main sort of contact of the FAO and the main organizer within the Bankers Union historically, and he eventually kind of led that split along with these folks that they absorbed from the Tupac. But the FAO still exists as the FAO. They're separate. So I would actually go even to locals of the PVP and interview folks who were ex-FAO members about their experiences in FAO. And they would talk about it, and they see it as sort of, their perspective is that the sort of organic trajectory of an anarchist is to eventually, when they mature, to become a Marxist. Right? Once you get rid of your sort of anarchist immaturity and irrationality, you take on scientific Marxism in some sort of way, and you go with the big boys type of thing. I don't know what. But again, that's a faction of the FAO. The role of the militant was to network struggles. So militants were organized into zones, right? And they were responsible with sort of maintaining an infrastructure, a regional infrastructure between different factories. Maybe a school would be there. They would have a sector of the ROE, the student worker resistance, to sort of maintain them into contact and to also sort of build a presence around anarchist praxis, build cells. Right, so build within a student movement a cell of students that would be, say, willing to, do these road shutdowns, the peaje, the toll booths, so that when there would be a factory strike, that there'd be a group of folks that could come from the outside and support it. Because these types of things were kind of organically just happening anyway. In ways that they write about it at the time, and the ways in which the militants that lived it, they talk about it as this was all just organically happening. One of them said, you would live like the equivalent of 2 years in 2 weeks. It was just happening so fast, and you were just growing so much in that whole thing, like it's just a blur. And everyone was going through this. 1 in 30 Uruguayans, adult Uruguayans at the time, were detained and imprisoned for some period of time. And of that, I want to say the number is somewhere around 70% of them experienced torture. So Uruguay at this time is actually like a torture laboratory. Like it becomes the site where torture techniques that are expanded to other parts of Latin America and eventually expanded to places like Guantanamo are first practiced.
Hi, I was just kind of jotting down notes as you were talking, and I guess my favorite parts of what you were saying were these sort of like glimpses of lived experiences and context. I guess, yeah, some of the questions that came up for me, it's like, I kind of got this feeling like, yeah, this might not be popular, but I guess when everything sort of feels like it has to amount to a political program, or I guess can be summarized as such, for me it just kind of brings the question of like, does it really necessarily matter what that program is? Because like, for me, I guess a program in itself kind of implies anarchism without anarchy, and I just wonder like, when you bring up this idea of a massified subject, I guess for me, I feel like I'd be more interested in kind of breaking the logic of organizing mandates and this sort of like insistent solidity of structured forms of subjectivity altogether. And I guess my question is kind of like, at what point does life kind of get to be free from representation? Or I guess I'm just kind of curious as to what, for you, like what is meant by revolution, and is that something you have to wait for, I guess?
I'm not going to speak on like my personal take on what is revolution, or like I'll tell you sort of how I encountered these types of, or responses to these types of questions from folks that I talked to. So one of the things I found was really interesting kind of addressing this was in the chapter that I do where I focus on the lives of these two women while they're operating the safe house. They would talk about, our entire life was compromised by the organization at the time. And that was something we signed up for. They very much see, folks who I spoke to from the FAO, very much see commitment to revolution, making revolution, is entailing some sort of compromise and self-sacrifice. And they, at the time, remember themselves eager to sign up for that, sort of recognizing especially what was in the zeitgeist of the era. They couldn't miss out on it, really. A point in which I remember Juliana, which is an alias actually for a person who I spent a lot of time with and participated quite a bit. She talks about the one time she remembers going to the beach while she was in her early 20s as a participant of the organization. And she eventually fell prisoner when the safe house was raided. And she was in prison for much of her 20s and 30s. And she remembered at this time having gone to the beach one time. Montevideo was surrounded by beaches. It's a peninsula. There's beaches everywhere. And she vividly remembered, because I asked, like, what did you guys do for fun? Everything was compromised. That chapter particularly is looking at this question of, what was the revolutionary subjectivity in that sense? What did it entail to be a militant? If you wanted to date folks that were underground in the organization, and again, this is an organization that was underground and elite. So it's also, not exactly the same context when we're talking right now. But they were like, we had to date within the organization. You couldn't date anyone outside because you can't even reveal who you are. That chapter kind of borrows from a Smith song. I'm an East LA Chicano, I can't help it. It's called To Know Half a Person. Right? That's actually the language that one of them used, is that you only know half a person even within the organization, because everyone was sort of operating with aliases, and you never shared, outside of your cadre of 4 people, they never shared any personal information. Even amongst those folks only knew each other based off of relating around political work, because it could be a compromise, because people were getting disappeared and tortured And if you knew anything, there was a risk that that information could come out. Participating in this type of circumstance is very unique, right? Like doing politics in that type of condition in which there was a viable chance of revolution even. I don't think we've even been in that circumstance here, to where a revolution was a viable alternative. It was on the horizon. It was something that people could actually see and imagine and taste. And what that entails for sort of social relations. Yeah, I've never had to deal with those types of questions, you know. And folks who did make these compromises, not a single person seemed to be apprehensive about it or reluctant to having done so. Many of them are still participating in the organization today, which still exists. The FAO still exists. So that's my best sort of attempt to address that.
Can you describe in what capacity the FAO exists today?
Low capacity. The conditions are quite different. Uruguay Montevideo looks like a big Detroit. It's an organization that has had to try to rebuild itself, and it's doing so with a lot of these folks that experienced this era and who, upon coming out of exile or coming out of prison, have managed to revive the organization. So they operate like a print shop, for example, in Montevideo that is it's organized as like a cooperative, and it's used by all the left to produce sort of, you know, pamphlets and flyers for labor conflicts and things like this. They operate an archive. There are some sort of fronts in which they're operating in. They have a relatively sort of, I wouldn't say strong, but there's a presence within teachers, metal workers. They're in the sort of leadership positions of the taxi union, which Uber's there. So much of its sort of emphasis now, those folks that are in the organization now are doing a lot of work around sort of maintaining a history as well as sort of sharing the model as a viable sort of organizing strategy. So places like Brazil, Chile, Argentina, you mentioned some of the other ones, South Africa, Australia, right? There's groups that are influenced by the strategy of especifismo here as well, Rosa Negra. But interestingly, I would say is that sort of, the model is kind of it's a guide. It needs to be sort of adapted to different contexts. Right? What do you do with this type of a model in a place that doesn't have a rich sort of tradition of organized labor? Or did, but it was, you know, essentially squashed over the span of a century, like in the US. Right? What does a social movement in which one inserts themselves as a revolutionary anarchist, what does that look like? What are your mass movements? Do we have mass movements? If the whole sort of strategy revolves around social movement militancy, agitating within mass movements for building a hegemony around anarchist praxis, what do you do in a context where there's no mass movements? But where we're even having to ask the question is, what is the mass movement? We can debate on something like that. And the fact that we can debate on that is already a different sort of, you know, you go to Argentina, they're going to tell you what their mass movements are. They know Argentine feminism is exploding. Here I don't know how clear it is. Or maybe they exist for a certain amount of time and then they kind of wane off. Right? It's not like the conditions in which some of these unions that they were operating in, you know, the meat packers union, I mean, that had a rich anarchist tradition in organizing in the meat factories since the beginning of the 20th century. There's like a foundation there, there's contacts there, there's a lineage. Same with the graphic artists there. It's a different context. Really what I'm trying to do with the work more than anything is use the FAO as a conduit for understanding what was going on in the Uruguayan labor movement more broadly. So yes, I am sympathetic to the FAO. Okay? It's a book about especifismo. It goes into some of the interworkings and interoperatings and debates of the FAO, but many of the chapters are just about worker conflict. And I'm using the FAO's documents because, again, the FAO is really interested in growing this type of workplace militancy, so they're documenting it. And so I use them as a conduit to understand this type of worker militancy, or militant worker subjectivity that was growing at the time. What were people doing? Because the communists weren't talking about it. So they'd be like, oh, there was a strike at the TEM factory, lasted for 10 days, and it's like, wait a second, like there's a lot going on at that time. That they were an above ground legalized press organ. It would either be censored or there was self-censoring information. The FAO was really useful, their documents, because they were really interested in these questions about direct action because they saw them as having a greater sort of political purpose. And so I used them to generate narratives, and you can see the type of just wild stuff that's going on. There's wild stuff that people were doing. It's pretty cool. So here it is. I've got them back there. Thanks to AK Press. Thanks for y'all coming out. I painted the cover, by the way. I'm really grateful to AK Press for allowing me to do that. I'm a sign painter by trade, so it was kind of a really fun exercise. We'll paint your own cover of your book. It's not common. So thanks everyone.